First, we've an exploration of the Yiddish language and literature in a new season of Bookmark.
The Shlmiel, the Shlmazl, and the Doppess. Or what is Yiddish?
Yiddish? That's some kind of American word or something? Or an English word?
Einer hat a date, gekommen ist die spät. Einer läuft zu Pinnacle, sagt Doppess.
Let's see. I would say like, greetings.
Shalom Aleichem, Radiozuhörers. Der Säger schluckt Finnef. Und der Vorwärtsshow ist auf der Luft.
Don't know what it means.
Soll ich vergleichen dich zum Sommertag? Du bist doch schöner viel und mehr gestellt. Es wird lieber Maiblied reu von Wind gejagt und Sommerzeit wird euch zu schnell verwelkt.
Sort of like colonial Jewish.
Erzähl mal. Sei gewesen Statisten, weißt du, was mit Statisten? Im Theater.
Yiddish. Yiddish is Jewish.
Mein Jiches, mein Seele ist gewesen, mein Tate ist gewesen, der schönste Lied in Städtel und soll schon nehmen das so.
Oi in Yiddish cannot be translated into any language. It cannot say oh. It is not the same. It hasn't got the pain. You know. It may have the wonderment, but it hasn't definitely got the pain.
Well, Yiddish, the word came from another planet, where a lot of Jews live, and they have their own language.
I was born in Russia. I was educated in Poland. I was a refugee in Russia. I was a refugee in China, in Japan, in Mexico, and I came to the States. But I was never a refugee in the land of Yiddish language.
Einer sagt die Deal auf Deutsch, neulich Frikadil. Einer kocht in a microwave.
I've called Yiddish the Robin Hood of languages. It borrows from every culture and every language and every place in which the Jews have been, and that has been everywhere around the world.
When I'm going to read about Yiddish, I feel like getting up. Give it all the honor to Yiddish.
Hartnäckiger Riech, also wie du bist sich nicht mach nie mein Befehl, geb ich dich über die Hand von die Herrliches.
Lasst mich, seht mich nicht, ich will nicht, ich kann nicht.
It's adapting itself to modern technology and modern science with a whole new glossaries of vocabulary. The one that comes to mind at the moment is Schmeckeldecker. It's the word for condom. Schmeckel is a brick, if you want to say that, and Decker is a cover. Schmeckeldecker.
Like all Jewish languages, Yiddish uses the Jewish alphabet. It's based on the ancient Aramaic alphabet. It reads right to left. It has 22 basic characters.
It's my language. It's the language in which I was brought up. It's the language which I spoke to my mother, the language in which my mother cuddled me, and the language in which she chastised me, the language in which she beat me, and the language in which she kissed me. In this language, my father chastised me. In this language, he dragged me to the synagogue. And heaven help me if I didn't go with him to the synagogue Saturday or whenever he went to the synagogue. And in this language, I fell in love. In this language with my girl. In this language, I married the girl. And the very last word I spoke to my wife. After that, I didn't see her anymore, was Yiddish.
As a heart craves for joy that is quenched, as parched throats for water long, the dumb people sought a language, yearned with a chattering tongue. From words simple as small copper coins, from plain speech straight from heart and head, the Yiddish mother tongue emerged like good new crisp homemade bread.
Yiddish represents the third period in Jewish linguistic history. The first was the Hebrew period in the ancient land of Israel, where Hebrew was the first classic language of the ancient Hebrews. That period began to come to a close with the Babylonian exile in 586 BC. Hebrew declined and declined until about the year 0. It was no longer a spoken language. It had been replaced by Jewish Aramaic. Aramaic is also a Northwest Semitic Near Eastern language. It was a language of Christ, of course. And Aramaic survived about another 1,000 years. About 1,000 years ago, the year 1000 AD or so, these are very rough dates just to give us some kind of rough idea, the European period in Jewish history starts. What happened was the Oriental centers of learning, of authority, were declining in Babylonia and in Israel, and new centers of rabbinic culture were arising in Central Europe, the most important of them along the Rhine and others along the Danube, when a group of settlers who were the first Ashkenazim, they came to be known as, the first members of this new tribe of Jews in Europe that ended up spreading all over Central and Eastern Europe, they brought their Hebrew and Aramaic with them. And these Hebrew and Aramaic elements, although they became the minority in the new language, Yiddish, they merged, they fused with the local Germanic dialects in a very specific way that spread east and west throughout Europe. Yiddish in Eastern Europe acquired a Slavonic component, which is prominent in all modern forms of Yiddish. So when you're talking about modern Yiddish, you've got to reckon with all three components, the Germanic, the Hebraic, and the Slavic. I can give you an example of a sentence that has words coming from all the various components of Yiddish. Der Seide wird mistamelein in dem Sefer dienstig. Der from Germanic, the. Seide, grandfather, from Slavic. Vet, will, from the Germanic. Mistame, probably from the Aramaic. Leinen, read, from Romance. In fact, there's a trickle of Romance in Yiddish. Dem, again Germanic. Sefer, sacred book, from the Hebrew. Dienstig, Tuesday.
The whole sentence meaning in English?
Der Seide wird mistamelein in dem Sefer dienstig. Grandfather will probably read this book on Tuesday. I would say there are three areas where Yiddish has a particularly prominent register, a great wealth of expressiveness. One is in the area of human relationships. In Yiddish, there is a massive vocabulary for every nuance of love, hate, care, disregard that can be used to convey these feelings with no matter what it is you're saying. For example, there's two particles, te and je. So if you put them into any sentence, it shows that you love the person you're talking to. You regard him with affection. So if you want to say to someone, come, it's just kum. But if you say tokum, or if you say tokum je, the subtext to that is come, and by the way, I think you're wonderful.
The description of types of human beings. In English, if you want to say that someone is stupid or inept, you begin to run short of synonyms after 4 or 5 or 6. In Yiddish, you've got 30. A Shlmiel, a Shlmazl, a Schnook, a Shlump, on and on and on. And then they become refined to such wonderful words that they grow up in different aspects of the Jewish culture, as Doppess. What is a Doppess? A Doppess is a man who is the perennial onlooker, but he never comments. Now, this came out of the garment industry, and they said, a Shlmiel is a man who runs his hot iron across the ironing board all day long. And every once in a while, because he's tired, he runs off the board, and the iron drops on the toe. On whose toe? A Shlmazl's. A Shlmazl is a sad sack. He's fortune's fool. He's the recipient of indignities. And they said, and the Doppess, who is watching, goes, you say, what? He said, that's what he does, the Doppess. That's all he does. He mourns, he regrets, but he is a type you can't depend on to do anything. He won't pick up the iron. He just goes. Now, the same type is called a tzitzer, a person who is known for sympathizing, but he won't give you a dime.
Then there's a whole range of psychoextensives, as the academics call them with their usual pretentiousness. These are phrases, parenthetic phrases, that
betray what it is you feel about whomever it is you're talking about. So if you say, Der Ballerboy soll gehaget werden, nicht gewollt geben mehr Geld. My boss didn't want to give me a raise, and you stick in the phrase, may he drop dead, then it doesn't really mean that. It's not violent, but it means I don't like this guy. Or a schwarz Jahr auf him, a black year on him. These phrases are interpolated, and an awful lot of research has been done on them. A second area, and a very different one, but also a very prominent one, is the area of logic, of precision, of legalistic thinking. This comes from a culture that for thousands of years prized Talmudic learning above all else. And the Talmud is above all a compendium of law, of legal debate.
Every dinner in a Jewish home is like a Socratic dialogue. And from the time I was 4 or 5, I'd hear my father say, "What's good about it?" And he turned to me, "What do you think makes a thing good?" Well, you have to use your head. Why did so-and-so do it? Why do you think he did that? What kind of a man is he?
A third area, and one that's become very prominent in the West through such interpreters as Woody Allen, is Yiddish humor. The language has a built-in humor. Very often it's a self-deprecating humor. Now, when I say the language has a built-in humor, I mean that there are specific linguistic mechanisms that are used if you're going to use Yiddish correctly, so you see life differently.
I was reminded of the joke about the men of Chelm in the bathhouse who were afraid to take off their clothes. Why? Because they were afraid that without their clothes, no one would know who they were and they would get mixed up. So one clever man hit upon a plan. He stripped naked and tied a red ribbon round his foot that everyone should know he was Chaim. But as he accidentally lost the ribbon, another man picked it up and tied it around his ankle. When Chaim discovered that he didn't have the ribbon, he was beside himself with anguish, until he caught sight of it around the ankle of the other man. "I know who you are," he said to its new owner, "but could you please tell me who I am?"
And then, of course, you have a rich system of intonation.
It's a language of an oppressed people, and therefore it develops subtleties that do not exist in languages of oppressing people. For example, a Jew has to be careful about what he says because there are punishable situations that he tries to avoid, and therefore he will do with a nuance which is very expressive, that doesn't, it's hard to reproduce in other languages.
If you say, "What does this guy do?" "Er's a doctor." He's a doctor. If you want to say he's a wonderful doctor, "Er's a doctor." If you want to say the guy's a quack, "Er's a doctor." So that famous rise-fall intonation, that of course has influenced English, is very prominent in Yiddish.
My famous example is a telegram that Trotsky sent to Stalin at the time of the Congress in Russia, in which the telegram overtly says, "Dear comrade, you are right. I am wrong. Socialism can be built in one country. Long may you prosper," something like that. And he rushed in and he showed the telegram to his Jewish brother-in-law and said, "You see, this is a great victory, a complete capitulation of Trotsky." So the Jewish brother-in-law said, "Wait a moment, Comrade Stalin. You don't know how to read this telegram. Here's how it should be read. Dear comrade, you are right. I am wrong. Socialism can be built in one country. Long may you prosper." Signed, Trotsky.
Watch yourself, überall kennt ihr das sein. Du hast ein VCR, ein Telefon in sein Car. Schreibt einer heute den ganzen Teuer. Watch yourself.
I said there was not a Jewish boy over 6 who didn't handle at least 3 languages. Now think of the cultural and psychological consequences. 3 languages. What 3? Well, Yiddish, which he spoke to his mother and father, Hebrew, which he used in the cheder and in studying and in discussions at the synagogue, and the language of whichever country he was in, Russian, Polish, Greek, German.
The world of Yiddish learning. These are some of the 40,000 books and periodicals housed in the YIVO Institute of Jewish Research in New York. Founded in 1940, this was the American equivalent of the YIVO Center in Vilnius, a city known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. When the Nazis destroyed and pillaged the libraries, they were destroying the greatest center of Yiddish scholarship in Eastern Europe. This collection, added to the American one after the war, consists of rare books the Nazis had sent to Germany and others hidden in conditions of great danger by the Jewish librarians in Vilnius. Here are books and periodicals from the 16th century to the present day. They cover all aspects of Jewish culture, religion and enlightenment, folklore and theater, fiction and linguistic scholarship. Written in Yiddish, or Mamaloschen, the mother tongue, the Jewish libraries of Eastern Europe attracted all sections of the people.
I'm not a man of culture, I'm a worker. But we used, at least the people, the workers with whom I used to socialize, we had a terrible yearning to also have some kind of cultural life, and we did our best. We strove as much as we could to achieve it. And books were important simply because this was our school. And all the education that we had was self-education, and this was supplied down through the books. But also we had translations of books by all the writers in the world. And in this language, we lived out our whole life, and a high cultural life, believe me. The word culture wasn't for us a word of which to be ashamed. We strove to live not only by the bread, but our brains also needed some food.
Zukunft, the future. First published in New York in 1892, was one of the hundreds of magazines printed to satisfy this hunger for culture. In Brooklyn, once one of the centers of Jewish immigration, are some of the contributors and editors of these periodicals.
Die Zukunft ist der älteste jiddische Journal auf der Welt.
We have many magazines, but the function and the great achievement of the Zukunft was that it was a magazine of the masses, and the masses created something which was unique. From jargon, they elevated Yiddish to the stature of a language.
There's an intimacy between writer and reader which you really cannot find practically in any other literature, whatever the reasons were, and they were there. Suddenly it became the voice of a people who before felt that their language, and I think it was stressed before, was only a jargon, and suddenly this little Cinderella blossomed forth.
Why specifically Yiddish literature is there that intimacy?
Again, I would say...
Question. That's
it's a basic question.
Yeah.
Again, I come back, I think, to the point of the language.
But yeah, you know, something, excuse me.
Well, I would...
I think Yiddish has this quality. If you speak Yiddish, you feel close to a person. It's not only in literature, it's an everyday relationship with people. You come into a store and he speaks, right away he's a brother of yours. Somehow it gives you a bond that's beyond understanding, perhaps. Maybe
it's a little more. It's a little more than this. The point was that until Yiddish literature in Hebrew, for example, was created for an upper stratum of the population. Yiddish literature suddenly felt that the literature addresses itself. They're not only the heroes who are written about, they suddenly found their voice and their language.
They elevated to a literary tool in which the deep emotions of a people, their vision, their dreams, and their experience was expressed in a very colorful, in a very exciting, in a very unique manner.
In attics and in cellars, on the back stairs late at night. To kitchen maids and apprentices, Yiddish was solace and delight.
Yiddish is not just a language. It's not a language of the ghetto. It's our whole culture, because the Yiddish literature ranks on par with any literature of any language.
The first writing in Yiddish is this prayer book of 1272. A Yiddish phrase is inscribed in the openings of the letters. It says, "A good day should come to the person who brings the prayer book to the prayer house." So Yiddish literature begins with piety, and this is the main substance of the literature for the next 5 centuries. Prayer books for women, Bible translations, religious manuals. And in addition, there were folk tales and popular novelettes. Then there was a revolution in the writing in the 19th century. Mendeler Mochos Forim, Mendeler the bookseller, was a writer and scholar who claimed that
Yiddish was an empty vessel filled only with ridicule, nonsense, and the twaddle of fools. People were ashamed to read Yiddish. I decided I would have pity for Yiddish, that rejected daughter, for it was time to do something for our people.
Similarly, Yitzhak Leib Peretz had written in Hebrew, Russian, and Polish. He also turned to Yiddish and encouraged younger writers to do the same. Sholem Rabinovitz, known as Sholem Aleichem, is the best known and most translated of Yiddish writers. He was without social ideology and one of those rare storytellers whose work sums up a whole culture. These 3 writers transformed Yiddish into creative literature that had a particular relationship with its audience.
The subject matter is often keyed into the historical experience of the Jews. After all, it is a language written by Jews and mostly for Jews. Until Shlmash, for instance, no Yiddish writer ever believed that he would have a wider audience outside of the Jewish sphere than inside. Shlmash was the first, and I.B. Singer is certainly his heir in that respect. So the subject matter, willy-nilly, reflects the Jewish historical experience. Now that could take one of 2 forms. Writers sometimes try to reflect the collective nature of that experience. One of the great inventions, if not the greatest single invention of Yiddish literature, is the image of the shtetl, right? What we know today about Jewish life in the market towns of Poland and Russia, we know mostly through the fiction writers.
Shall I call it a beautiful little town? From a distance, it looks, how shall I say, like a loaf of bread thickly studded with poppy seed. Some of the houses are built on the slope of a hill, and the rest are huddled together at the base, one on top of the other, like the gravestones in an ancient cemetery. There are no streets to speak of, because the houses are not built according to any plan. Besides, where's there room for such a thing? Why should there be vacant space when you can build something on it? It's written that the earth is to be inhabited, not merely to be gazed at.
Long before we had any historical documentation, we had Mendeler Mochos Forim, and we had Sholem Aleichem, and we had Peretz, inventing, in fact, an image of the shtetl. And what that image was of a Jewish collective presence in exile. Sometimes the portrait was extraordinarily bleak. If you read Peretz's travel pictures of 1890, you will see a panorama of not only of decay, but of apocalyptic ruin.
It's a dead town. I'm speaking of a town which from the day it was built hung by a hair. And now the hair has snapped, it hangs by nothing at all. And because it hangs by nothing and floats in midair, it's a dead town.
It's as if Peretz were saying, and this is somewhat anachronistic, if I keep writing this way, I'll have to turn into Kafka. Because this world is a world of total absurdity, and there's nothing more that can be said except to chronicle its decay. Many writers after Peretz take up the subject of the shtetl, and the more time passes and the more the shtetl actually recedes as an historical entity, as a real place where the majority of Jews live, the more its symbolic valence arises.
That's how they all are, these little people. None of them are gloomy, none of them are worried, little men of affairs, but on the contrary, they're known everywhere as jesters, storytellers, a cheerful, light-hearted breed of men, poor, but cheerful. It's hard to say what makes them so happy. Nothing, just sheer joy of living. Living? If you ask them, How do you live? They will answer with a shrug and a laugh. How do we live? Who knows? We live.
Shalom Aleichem. That means hello. I am Shalom Aleicham's granddaughter, and I'm standing at his grave in front of his monument, the Workman's Circle, where he wished to be buried. In his will, which incidentally was printed at full in the New York Times and read into the congressional record, he said, "Wherever I may die, let me be buried not among the rich and famous, but among the plain folk, the workers, so that my monument may honor the simple graves around me, and their simple graves honor mine, just as the poor people honored their folk writer in his lifetime." And according to the New York Times, 150,000 people, young and old, lined the streets of New York at his funeral. On this monument is his epitaph, which he wrote himself in 3 stanzas in Yiddish, which I translated. "Here lies a plain and simple Jew who wrote in plain and simple prose, wrote humor for the common folk to help them to forget their woes. He scoffed at life and mocked the world. At all its foibles he poked fun. The world went on its merry way and left him stricken and undone. And while his grateful readers laughed, forgetting troubles of his own, midst their applause, God only knows, he wept in secret and alone."
Is there a distinctive Yiddish tone in the literature?
That's a tough one. To the extent that Yiddish is governed by the folk voice, to the extent that Yiddish writers try to connect back to the spokenness of the language, I would say definitely yes. The wry humor, self-deprecating humor, the sarcasm that we normally associate with Yiddish, I think has to do with that connection to it being a spoken vernacular.
There's a story of the Kazrilevkite who got tired of starving in Kazrilevka and went out into the wide world to seek his fortune. He left the country, wandered far and wide, and finally reached Paris. And there, naturally, he wanted to see Rothschild. For how can a Jew come to Paris and not visit Rothschild? But they didn't let him in. But a Kazrilevkite never gives up. He thought for a while and said to the doorman, "Tell your master, it isn't an ordinary beggar who's come to his door, but a Jewish merchant who's brought him a piece of goods such as you can't find in Paris for any amount of money." Hearing this, Rothschild became curious and asked that the merchant be brought to him. "Shalom Aleichem," said Rothschild. "Aleichem Shalom," said the merchant. "Take a seat. And where'd you come from?" "I come from Kazrilevka." "What good news do you bring?" "Well, Mr. Rothschild, they say in our town you're not so badly off. And honors, I imagine, you don't lack either, for people always look up to a man of riches. Then what do you lack? One thing only, eternal life. That is what I have to sell you." When Rothschild heard this, he said, "Well, let's get down to business. What will it cost me?" "It'll cost you," here the man stopped to consider, "it'll cost you 300 rubles. Rothschild said no more, but counted out 300 rubles, one by one. As our Kazrilevkite slipped the money into his pocket, he said to Rothschild, "If you want to live forever, my advice to you is leave this noisy, busy Paris and move to our town of Kazrilevka. There, you can never die, because since Kazrilevka has been a town, no rich man has ever died there."
The other tone, of course, is that of lament, an elegiac tone, and that you will find very prominent as well in Yiddish literature. And the longer the poets live, the more they are forced to cultivate that elegiac tone. Say, if they survive the First World War, and certainly after the Holocaust, that becomes the most dominant mode of, certainly of Yiddish poetry.
Glust sich mir zu ton at viele, weiß ich nicht zu wemmen. Der, was hat amol getreist mich, wird es nicht vernehmen. Weiß ich nicht zu wemmen, tut das Herz mir klemmen. Efter soll ich beten bei a Stern, Freund mein weiter, hab mein Wort verloren. Komm und sei mir a Verbeiter, euch der guter Stern wird es nicht der Herrn. Nur at viele sagen Musik, emets gor anonter, peinigt sich in meine Schome und dit viele munter. will ich on Asinen plappeln bis beginnen. Date, January 17, 1942.
It was then, in Vilnius, that the young Dina Abramovich, a partisan, was separated from her mother, who perished in the Holocaust.
What does it mean in English?
I want to say a prayer, but I don't know to whom. Maybe I will ask the star, my dear friend, I lost my word. Come and speak for me. But even the good star will probably not hear me. But I must say the prayer because somebody very close suffers in my soul and he tells the prayer. So I will say the prayer without maybe the meaning, but all the time from the evening to the morning, I will say a prayer.
Does the Jewish experience favor a different form between Yiddish poetry and English poetry?
Thank you very much for asking that question. I am delighted that you asked that question. There is a difference between Yiddish and English form. I will tell you. Now, I'll use this book as to be able to illustrate what I want to say. Because the English language is a hopeful language. It uses the ayam, and the ayam is in the center of Yiddish poetry, of English poetry. Now, the Yiddish poetry is a manifestation of the long Yiddish tragic history, and it uses trochee. Now, to give an example of it, we'll take, for instance, Lord Byron. Let's take just one line. He uses the ayam, and he uses the ayam beautifully. He's a great poet. She walks in beauty like the night. Unaccented, accented. That's ayam. And that's what Lord Byron used. That's what mostly Shelley used. Keats, Byron, Swinburne. They use the ayam very much. It's interesting. Why did he use the ayam so much more than the other forms? Trochee, anapes, dactyl. There's a reason for that. It is hopeful. Now let me give you an example of the prince of the Yiddish poets, Manya Leib. Here, it goes in trochee. Beautiful, that great poet, Manya Leib. Täuben, stille, bläue Abendstunden. Spreit vor mir mein stillen Träumchen spreiter. Itster, glien, gluti, Kehr und Reute. Meine Reute, meine Wunden, meine Reute, Reus. It is trochee. Perfect trochee. Manya Leib used trochee. It fits for his body. What did he say, Manya Leib? He said that the evening is coming and he once more dream. Now he feels that his wounds are roses, red roses. He compares his wounds to roses. Because what is he used to keep on always? He wants to get something beautiful for his wounds. He had plenty in his poetry already about wounds comparing to something terrible. This time he compares it to roses. But it's in perfect trochee. The trochee is a descending form. The sad way of writing it.
I would say that what really makes Yiddish special, different, perhaps unique, is the push and pull between its being a vernacular, a folk language, and the attempt on the part of Jewish intellectuals, thinkers, politicians, to make it a vehicle of modern thought, of Europe, of enlightenment, of emancipation, of progress, of social revolution, of change, of modernity.
We were 400 years late. It started in the 19th century. Practically, the Yiddish literature has achieved what it took the English literature, the English poetry, from Chaucer way down to Auden. We have achieved that in that short of time, in that short space.
Don't forget that our medievalism lasted longer. You see, so with the 19th century, things began to spread out. For instance, I myself, when I said to my parents that I want to be a painter, they couldn't care less, fine. But it wasn't always like this. For example, the mother of Antokolsky of the Russian sculptor, we are told when she saw the boy carving with a knife a piece of wood, she smacked his hand, took away the penknife, and told him never, never, never to do it again. No Jew should do it. The mother of Chagall was already admiring him and even took him to an artist to show his work, and even was so proud that she uttered, well, you have talent, maybe you'll be a photographer. The mother of Yankel Adler, and this he told me himself, she took great pride in his work and said to him, you will be another Hirschenberg. And Hirschenberg was a very popular Jewish painter, a very good painter, by the way, you know. But the very fact you see here, from nothing to being able to mention a name, and this meant a whole transition in culture. This implied a whole transition in cultural life.
From the beginning, it wasn't a literature restricted to one country. It was in Poland, it was in Romania, it was in Russia, it was in America, it was in Canada. That was one element of great importance. There were influence of different other literatures. Then life wasn't static. The masses were moving from one country to another, from one historical landscape to another. So everything was in process of transformation. And this transformation affected the literature. It became a world literature.
Now a generation of poets strides through hunger and want and strife and weaves the bright red thread of our bubbling time and life. From Moscow to Buenos Aires, from Frisco to Birobijan, over oceans and cities and prairies echoes the tread of the fighting man. Over the heights and the deeps, fearless of danger and death we tread, and the song of our mother Yiddish rises like new crisp homemade bread.
The ideology of modern Yiddish literature was amelioration, to improve the Jewish people, to make them more productive, to make them more like the nations among whom they lived. But then other ideologies entered into the scene. Jewish nationalism, either in the form of Zionism or the Bund, the Jewish labor movement, which was more cosmopolitan, but also had a strong national component and tried to make Yiddish into a vehicle of social revolution among the Jewish working classes. So as the ideologies change, so too does the intention. By the middle of the early part of the 20th century, you have a reaction against that in such writers as I.B. Singer.
One demon speaks to another. Enlightenment. In the 200 years you've been sitting in your tail here, Satan has cooked up a new dish of kasha. The Jews have now developed writers. Yiddish ones, Hebrew ones. They've taken over our trade. We grow hoarse talking to every adolescent, but they print their kitsch by the thousands and distribute it to Jews everywhere. They know all our tricks. Mockery, piety. They've 100 reasons of why a rat must be kosher. All that they want to do is to redeem the world.
Angekimmen, die beste Chile zu genehmen, Masche Chaim, Bursch mir, Chatta, Kitzel in die Stiel,
find a Jew who's neutral about Yiddish. You either love Yiddish or you hate Yiddish. It's part of the status, the sociology of Yiddish, that Yiddish inspires great passions in people.
It is drenched with tears and blood that come pouring like a flood from the wounds that never cease of our Jewish agonies. In Yiddish, I've never heard a single warm and glowing word.
Then I lay her sweet head upon my breast, and she is beautiful, full of charm and young, and I murmur, my dear, my beloved, my Yiddish word, my Yiddish song.
There are among Jews, there always have been, people who thought that Yiddish is the language of the lowest kind of Jewish people. If you want to be a cut higher, you must throw away Yiddish, you must adopt whatever language you like, be it Polish, be it German, whatever.
In Berlin in the 18th century, suddenly Yiddish became something disgraceful. You have to assimilate and get rid of that separate language and the separate clothing and become Germans of the Mosaic faith. We all know, of course, the results of that theory ultimately in terms of what happened. In the 19th century, you had an antagonism toward Yiddish that came from the Zionist and Hebraist movements who wanted to revive Hebrew. They perhaps had the most bitter hatred of Yiddish of anyone because they were all native Yiddish speakers themselves, the revivers of modern Hebrew. And there's no hate stronger than self-hate.
Although Yiddish was the language of the Zionist settlers, it was abhorred and suppressed by them. It was regarded as the language of the diaspora, the ghetto, the persecutions, and the pogroms. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, modern Hebrew became the official language. But as the years passed, Yiddish became more tolerated, and there is now a modest revival. But the memories of the earlier attitudes are deeply rooted.
When the guest chambers were working full blast, continually, day and night, this girl was a member of a Zionist organization, brought up, so to speak, in a Zionist organization, in one of the youth organizations. She was, I think, from Latvia. And somehow she managed to escape from that hell and smuggle herself in those days, to Palestine as it was then. And she came to, I think, one of the kibbutzim, and the only language you could speak was Yiddish. And she told them what was going on in Poland and in all the countries under German domination, about the concentration camps, all this. And Ben-Gurion was present, and he grabbed the microphone from her, and in Hebrew shouted, she speaks a language, it's a rumbling language. He can't suffer it. See? It's an offense to his ears, to such an extent. Well, this girl couldn't speak anything else. She couldn't even in Palestine. And she was brought up in a Zionist youth organization.
You had an antagonism in the West. You had poor immigrants, most of them tailors in the East End of London or the Lower East Side of New York City, and they wanted nothing more than success in American or in British terms for their kids to become a doctor, to become a lawyer, at least an accountant if you're not good enough for the other two. And the idea was you had to get rid of Yiddish, or else you'd have a Jewish accent, or else you'd be funny, or else you wouldn't be taken seriously, and it became something to be ashamed of.
The Yiddish spoken at home was rather quite repellent. So I stuck to my Polish language. But at the age of about 14 or 15, I came across some younger Jewish students and intellectuals who spoke a magnificent Yiddish, and I fell in love with the language.
Wie die Wilje aber breite, wie die Bämer grün beneite, leicht war Freiheitslicht auf dein Gesicht, auf dein Gesicht.
The Holocaust devastated European Jewry. The living embodiments of Yiddish culture were destroyed. The writers, the readers, the speakers of Yiddish were virtually exterminated. Out of the estimated 6 million dead, 5 million were Yiddish speakers. In London, a handful of survivors and their relatives gather. They are known as the Friends of Yiddish. They meet weekly, reading and singing to each other. Tonight is special. They light candles, each one representing 1 million killed. They are commemorating the uprisings against the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto and in the death camps, keeping the flame of Yiddish alive.
Weißer Stern streckt zu mir deine weiße Hand. Meine Wörter seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand. Seh es dunkelt, sehe finkel in mein kellerdicken Blick, und ich hab Gott nicht kein Winkel.
Kinder in Ghetto, von Hinger geschwollener Stein, das nackte Leib in der stechige Regens in Schneien. Sei betlen, a Krischkele Bräut, a Kartoffel, dem Hinger zu stillen.
Bei dein Wickel auf dein Haare sitzt der Fremde und singt.
Gott Allmächtige, mein Kind, wie soll a Mama schützen es erzint? Du hast doch es beschaffen, schaff es euch ab, öffnen euch, die Mama Erd soll es sie geben, uns der Grüb. Und wem in Weste schweigen doch, der Leuten dem Gewalt, will an eigene Fäusten bald dem Nefeschel einstillen mit mein Willen. Wo schweigst du dort, mein Gott? Wie soll ich jetzt euch teitschen, los ihr Zach, dein Gebot? Jiske.
Gemutigt von Kleininken nicht suchen, vor dem neuen, freiem Dom. Gemutigt von Kleininken nicht suchen, vor dem neuen, freiem Dom.
The last part of the 20th century has seen a revival again. I think this has to be seen in two components. The first component comprises the Hasidim. There are millions of Hasidim around the world who speak only Yiddish in their families. They have a birth rate of 10 to 20 kids per family. They're thriving on every continent. And I resent terms like ultra-Orthodox and fanatics. They're not. This is their culture. They're unreconstructed Ashkenazim.
But on the Hasidic Jews, if you talk to them about creative literature, they don't even read it, they don't write it.
Absolutely. They have their traditional Ashkenazic culture, not modern Yiddish culture. But to me, it's very small-minded not to see it as part of the demographic strength of the language. I'd like to make a prediction now that in the 21st century, many young Hasidim will become interested in Yiddish as something for its own sake. But outside the Hasidic world, the second component I wanted to get into has to do with this revival. I think that was the word you used, Jack, if I'm not mistaken. Well, there are now 5,000 to 10,000 young people in the world, Jews and non-Jews, who have become passionately in love with Yiddish since the 1960s, or from the 1960s onward.
Dacht ich mir, was mehr mir redt darin die verschiedene Chilike Deis, als Neventer kommt man zu a richtigen Pschat, und als Kliege kann man werden.
I thought I would be the last Yiddish speaker in the world, but now I see people writing it who are young enough to be my children. I think, well, if they've got the strength and the courage to go on, why shouldn't I be part of the workshop, too?
Oh, yeah.
English we have to share with hundreds of millions of people. Yiddish is something that's a little homier for us. It's closer to the heart, shall we say.
Even though it's not my first language, it's a very geschmackte
language, a very tasty language.
I think that they simply want to isolate themselves a little more from the all-around language, from the English, which to them swallows every cultural effort. So they'd rather do it in their own language.
My students ask me, why should I speak Yiddish? And I tell them I don't want Hitler to have succeeded.
His Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, people are asking me often, why do you write in a dying language? And I want to explain it in a few words. Firstly, I like to write ghost stories, and nothing fits a ghost better than a dying language. The deader the language, the more alive is the ghost. Ghosts love Yiddish, they all speak it. Secondly, I believe in resurrection. I'm sure that the Messiah will soon come and millions of Yiddish-speaking corpses will rise from their graves one day. And their first question will be, is there any new Yiddish book to read?
From 10 million to 5 to 10,000 is a terrible, terrible fall. I look at it a different way. From 0 to 5,000 is statistically 1,000,000 times more important. And that is where I think we're at now. I know, for example, that of the 700 students who studied Yiddish only during the summer at summer courses at Oxford, about 200 are now Yiddish teachers. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but if you start figuring out how many students they have, we're now into snowballing statistics. Now, we're not prophets, we're not prognosticators in Oxford, but all I'd like to say is that so much is happening that there's no time to die.
Ich studiere Yiddish in Heidelberg.
It may find itself in the doldrums of Latin or ancient Greece, that is to say, when it becomes a university language, you know? But there will always be some people who will have a great love for the language and for what was done with it.
We are here in Holyoke, Massachusetts, in the repository of the National Yiddish Book Center. What you are looking at is the largest collection of Yiddish books ever assembled at any time in Jewish history. On this floor alone are more than 900,000 Yiddish volumes, virtually all of which have been rescued out of basements and attics and garbage dumpsters and demolition sites, and a very large number of which would have been otherwise destroyed. At the same time, Yiddish was being studied all over the world by increasing numbers of students, and books simply were no longer available. Something needed to be done about it. That someone had to organize a campaign and get out there and round up Yiddish books before it was too late. As a student, I just knew the intrinsic value of that literature. In June of 1980, we opened our doors. I had a typewriter from government surplus and an old picnic table, and sat down and typed out press releases and sent them all over North America that said, for the first time in 50 years, young people are studying Yiddish again, and if you have old books, please send them on in. And then I waited. I waited about 3 days, 4 days, and the first letter began arriving, and the second letter, and soon there were hundreds of letters arriving. And within the first month, we had recovered several thousand volumes that arrived through the mail. Along with those letters, though, came letters of a very different sort. Letters from older Jews who said, I'd be happy to donate my books. I have a large library, but there are far too many books for me to ship them to you. Can you please come and get them? Well, I don't know, somehow I never expected this before. So starting out in the summer of 1980, I set out for the very first time. And I'll give you one example of the first trip that'll probably illustrate exactly what I was up against. The very first stop I ever made, I had received a postcard. Actually, it was a penny postcard which arrived postage due, which gives you some sense of the age of the man who sent it. Turned out it was from a man who was 87 years old and lived in a high-rise building for the Jewish elderly in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And he wrote to say, Dear Mr. Lansky, I have many books to give you. I am too old to pack them and ship them to you. Please help me out. He was very poor. He didn't have a telephone, so I sent him a telegram telling him when I'd arrive. And I got a hold of a ratty old rental van, and I drove down there my very first collection trip. I arrived at Atlantic City right on schedule at noontime on this hot, steaming day, and this man's waiting for me in the lobby, and he's wearing a heavy wool suit. You can see him, it's hot outside. And I said, look, I hope you haven't been waiting too long. He says, well, actually, I've been here since 7 o'clock this morning. I didn't want I should miss you. And he has the suit on because this is a major moment in his life. And he brings me upstairs to his apartment, and it's a small little one-room apartment with a metal bedstead and a table with a hot place and some bottles of medicine, and hundreds of Yiddish and Hebrew books. Well, I figured this would be easy. I would load the books onto a hand truck, roll them out, and be done with it. No, he sat me down at the kitchen table, and he started handing me one book at a time, and he said, well, junger man, I have to tell you, junger man means young man. It's become my generic name in the Yiddish world. He says, well, junger man, he says, this book, my wife and I, we bought in 1927. We didn't eat lunch for a week. We should be able to save the money to buy it. And this book, this was about such, every book had a story to go with it. And sitting there, I suddenly realized what I was about to be doing for the next 10 or 15 years of my life, that this was truly a process of cultural transmission. One generation was passing on its treasures to the next. Here I am, a young bearded guy, 23 years old, in dungarees and a t-shirt. He doesn't know who I am. But as he said, it was his last chance for hemshach, for continuity, to pass on this culture. That same day, this man lived in a high-rise building for the Jewish elderly. As I'm getting ready to drive off, he looks at me and says, "Ein minut, junger man." Wait a minute, young man. He says, "What about all the other people in the building?" He takes me through this building. I said, "All the other people in the building?" He says, "That's right." He says, "They all have books for you." I look up 12 stories of older Jews living in apartments. He takes me to every door. He knocks on the door and he says, "Seid mir moichel, der junger man darf haben Bücher." This young man here needs books. The younger man's gestanden. I don't know whether I'm coming or going. People are coming out with baskets and suitcases and boxes full of books. And that process of cultural transmission was repeated over and over again, and soon learned what I was up against over the next 10 years. We're not a geniza or a mausoleum or a warehouse for dead books. This is very much a living center. The shorter these books stay on the shelves, the happier I will be. It's very possible that Yiddish will not survive as a spoken language. Certainly the social circumstances which brought it to birth no longer prevail. But that Yiddish represented a crucial aspect of Jewish creativity, that it was the literature which recorded that juncture where Jews encountered the modern world and tried to understand what it was all about. All that took place in Yiddish, and it will be studied for many years to come. So our primary goal here is to match old books with new readers. We're doing that by setting up libraries of Yiddish literature all over the world.
This particular collection of literary and historical books is being sent to the Soviet Union, a country which after the revolution in 1917 had uniquely supported Yiddish culture. Then in 1948, the Stalinist suppression started. The very Yiddish type was melted down and nothing was published. Jewish writers, actors, musicians were arrested, and many of them killed. The state that had once encouraged Yiddish culture to bloom now rooted it out. This shipment is a chance for Hemshech to pass on and revive Yiddish culture.
We insist, and our insistence has a historic basis, that Yiddish remain, and I stress remain, a flowing cultural, literary, spiritual influence within the people. So we stop taking its pulse or finding out whether it's still alive. As far as we're concerned, it must stay alive.
And you're gonna say, "Ot is a matana," everybody.
Ot is a matana.
Un abyssal haze, what does abyssal mean?
A little high.
Good. Good, abyssal haze, un nishkoshe. When you see your mamas on Mother's Day, you can go up to them and say, "A good day, Mama's Tag."
Then the child asked the mother, "How long do you think one Jew will speak to another Jew Yiddish?" "As long as there are rivulets on earth. No sea, no ocean on earth will swallow that little rivulet Yiddish. It is forever and ever."
Bis Griechen bei der letzte Hand die kalte kon Jiddisch aufreißen dem Univers. Until the last cold hand will reach us, Yiddish is still able to explode the universe.